Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Yuko Kuwabara's play, One Night. Now this is a play that I found difficult to get into. And part of the reason is I think this is one of those plays that probably works better in performance than when you're reading it. In part because it seems like a lot of the conflict and a lot of the character development is really done subtly or through implication in ways that kind of seem to depend on the actor's performance rather than necessarily being clear from a reading. Like, there's a lot of the dialogue that just reads as very vague in terms of what characters' motivations are, what the conflicts are, why characters are looking at the world in particular ways, etc., etc. Things are not particularly spelled out. For the most part. There are some things that definitely are, but there's often just the interpersonal relationships between people are not made explicit, which as a reader makes it somewhat difficult to follow what's going on in portions of the play. There's also the problem that there's just continual entrances and exits in this play. This is something that I noticed as well with Shiro Medea's Isn't Anyone Alive, which I'm going to do a video about for next week. A lot of entrances and exits, very short scenes. And part of the problem is that from a reading perspective, that makes it fairly difficult to follow because you have a lot of stuff going on and it's being developed in tiny bits and pieces. Again, I think it would be a lot easier to follow if I were seeing this play performed rather than trying to follow it on the page. But here's what I got. Here's what I think is interesting about this play. So maybe not the protagonist, because there doesn't seem to be a central protagonist necessarily, but the driving force of the play is Koharu Inamura, who is, according to the character listing, age 56, mother of the Inamura family. So what that means, basically, she has 3 kids, I guess. I thought she had more than 3 kids, but she's got 3 kids. Daiki, Sonoku, and Yuji. The opening of this play is set, basically the whole thing is set in the Inamaru taxi company. Initially it was Inamura taxi, but then later, so Koharu, we start out 15 years in the past, and she basically comes in to the office of the taxi business where her children are and is like, hey, your father was super, super abusive to all of us, and so I murdered him. And they're like, what? That doesn't seem right. And she's like, yeah, I totes did that. Hit him with a car. Now I'm going to go to the police. I'm going to tell them it was an accident. I'll probably spend a few years in jail. Then I'll probably stay away for a while till the social stigma of killing your father dies down. Then I'll be back in 15 years. So that's the opening. And the kids are like, wow, this is not great. I'm not real thrilled with this situation. But it is a fait accompli. Dad's already dead. Mom's already decided that she has to go. So that's what happens. Then we come back in the actual play 15 years later. Koharu's brother and taken over management of the company. So his name was, because he's now dead, he never shows up, Shinichiro Marui. So he changed the name to Inamaru Taxi rather than Inamura Taxi, combining the two family names. You know, clever stuff there. Now his son, Susumu Marui, is now in charge of the company. There's a bunch of drivers. They all have their own interpersonal conflicts and relationships and things like this. Daiki is married to Fumiko, and that marriage is not in a good place. Daiki is working for Fuku-chan's Appliances, which Fumiko's father owns. Sonoko is technically a bar employee, but she seems to be more an alcoholic than an employee as such. And Yuji is a freelance writer who largely lives outside this small town. So, they're all sort of kicking around at Inamaru Taxi, and Koharu returns. So initially, Sonoko is really happy about this. Yuji is really happy about this. Yumi, who was Koharu's best friend, is super thrilled about this. Susumu Marui is pretty pleased. He's not the most thrilled, but he's like, yeah, good to have you back. So that's essentially what happens. And then basically the remainder of the story is mostly about trying to adjust to Koharu's return and some of the interpersonal conflicts of the individual drivers, conflicts between the drivers and their families, and how those things sort of shape this shared space of Inamaru Taxi. One thing that we find out is that despite the initial warm welcome of Koharu back into this family space, this business space, things have not necessarily been collegial in terms of how her children have dealt with the whole situation. Both her killing their father, but also the social stigma associated with it. So at one point, we find out, because Koharu meets Fumiko, and Daiki comes out at some point. So Koharu and Fumiko and Daiki are in the process of getting a divorce. It's hard to read Fumiko because she's often sort of written off by other characters as just being a drama queen, just trying to sort of manufacture grievances, things like this. Daiki has a pretty significant stutter, and it's not clear that he had that stutter prior to this murder, so that's an interesting development. But because of that, it's hard to get a sense of what he thinks about anything because he doesn't say much. And his actions are open to significant interpretation. But Fumiko doesn't know who Koharu is. They had never met, and nobody has sort of introduced them and said, hey, this is Koharu, Daiki's mother. So, Fumiko says, I've really been a good, helpful wife, you know. I went against my parents and married him. They were really dead set against it. Koharu says, of course, of course. Fumiko says, but I've tried very hard to get them to understand him, including the past. Koharu says, stage directions say, Daiki comes out of the Inamaru house with a change of wear for Yoshinaga. That's a different character. His presence is not clearly explained either. He's got some sort of interpersonal relationship with Koharu from when between the time when she was in prison and the end of the 15 years when she returned to her family, Yoshinaga and she had some kind of connection, but it's not really clear. Noticing Fumiko, he comes to a halt in the process. That's Daiki comes to a halt in the process. Fumiko says, instead of his deceased parents, Koharu says, huh? Fumiko says, I wanted to support him as family, but Koharu says, deceased parents. Fumiko says, yes. Koharu says, they died. Fumiko says, no, my parents are alive. Koharu says, oh. Fumiko says, haven't you heard? Daiki says, mom? Fumiko says, Daiki? Daiki falls silent. Fumiko says, that's a horrid way of calling me. Daiki says, huh? Fumiko says, just because I bore you a baby, I don't want to be called mom by you. Daiki says, that's not what. Fumiko says, how did we become like this? Koharu says, mom. Fumiko says, please stop that. Koharu says, you misunderstand. Me, I'm the mom. Fumiko says, what? End of scene. So, this is the first real solid indication we get that there has been significant strife around Koharu and the murder and things like this. The fact that Daiki chose to tell his boss and then future in-laws and wife that his mother was dead, rather than that there had been an accident in which his dad was killed and she had gone to prison, etc., etc. The fact that he thought that was a better plan than telling them the truth is somewhat telling about the impact that these events have had on Koharu's children. We similarly learn that the reason Sonoru is an alcoholic, or at least one of the main reasons that Sonoru is an alcoholic, is because of the social stigma that she's faced. The reason that Yuji doesn't have a sort of solid job, social stigma, etc., etc. So all of these things have had deep psychological and personal impact on them. And Yuji is kind of the one who explains this to Koharu, that these things have happened to them over the years. Because Koharu and Yuji are talking about Daiki, and Koharu says, Fuku-chan's appliances. I thought he was working at a foreign company. Yuji laughs and says, that's hardly likely. Koharu says, huh? Yuji says, after that kind of incident, usually an applicant wouldn't reach the preliminary offer of employment. If Dai hadn't met his wife at his part-time work, he still wouldn't know what to do. Koharu says, really? Yuji says, Sis went to vocational school, but she couldn't stand the gossip and quit. I got bullied at school and left town. Koharu says, Yuji says, neither Dai's finger nor stutter will heal. Sis is hanging out with alcoholics like Dad. None of us three know how to drive a car. Even now on Dad's Memorial Day, we get harassed by phone. That's how it is. So it seems like Koharu didn't really fully understand the implications of the choice that she made. Or the other way of looking at this, and I think this is maybe it's more charitable, certainly. It might be more accurate. When we opened in the sort of the prologue, basically, of this play, all of the children were bruised. I think Yuji's arm was in a sling. Everybody had been injured from their dad beating them. So I think Koharu makes a calculated decision that it is better for her children to face whatever the negative repercussions of this accident might be than it is for them to remain with their abusive father. Whether or not that is a good calculation is really difficult to assess here. But there does seem to be this lingering resentment over Koharu having killed her husband, because late in the play, they go to a memorial ceremony for the mother-in-law of Yumi. I think it's Yumi's mother-in-law. I don't 100% remember, but it's somebody's mother-in-law. So they go to a memorial service, and while they are out, all of the taxis have their tires punctured, and on one of the taxis is left a magazine article about Koharu and this murder. And so it's pretty clear that that is if that's the implication, it's pretty clear that that's the implication. The taxis were vandalized on the basis of Koharu having returned. And so there's a lot of conflict here. There's a lot of sort of interpersonal turmoil. And that's not even to address at all the more minor characters, the more peripheral characters and their interpersonal conflicts. It's a play in which a lot of stuff happens, but it basically centers around this issue of the choice that Koharu makes and its long-term implications for her family.